Again, Carlo Dade with the Canada West Foundation, and it's my privilege and honor to be able to introduce our next guest. This, I think, is one of the more important talks that we're going to have at the conference. Every talk is important, but when we sat down with IPD, putting this version of the conference together, we wanted to focus on having voices beyond the federal government. In Ottawa, of course, we think of the Indo-Pacific Strategy, we think of engagement, and we think of the federal government. But not just coming from Western Canada, working with the private sector, working with the provinces, working with producer associations, we understand how important all of Canada engagement is for our success in the region. So we reached out to Minister Ang. She was originally on the program. We reached out to the opposition. Actually, we did more than reach out. We worked our way through the shadow cabinet and through caucus to invite the opposition to talk about the longevity of the strategy in Canada. And we worked very hard with the provinces and territories. The importance of the provinces and why we spent so much time is that in many ways, the provinces are leading in terms of Indo-Pacific engagement, literally leading. Le gouvernement de Québec a lancé son propre stratégie pour l'Indo-Pacifique en avance du gouvernement fédéral. A year ahead of the federal government, Quebec had its own strategy. Saskatchewan, with barely 2 million people, has opened new offices in the region. And governments like Quebec have taken the lead on trade infrastructure. I think many people don't realize, but Canada's trade infrastructure, the global perception, has dropped from top 10 a decade ago to 32nd today. If you can't move goods, you can't sell goods to the region. If your customers don't believe you can move goods, you're digging yourselves out of a hole in terms of trying to engage the region. But the premiers have taken the leadership on this. At a breakfast in Manitoba at the Council of the Federation, co-hosted by the Canadian Chamber, Premier Pillai and his colleagues across the Federation stepped up to take leadership from the provincial level in addressing trade infrastructure. So for this and many reasons, we really wanted to focus on the provinces and territories, and we were indeed honored and delighted when the Premier of Yukon stepped forward to accept the invitation to present a provincial and territorial perspective. So, my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the Premier from the Yukon, Ranj Pillai.
Great, thank you. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say, it's an absolute pleasure. This is a incredibly talented group of people that are here. So I'm hoping that I can share a little bit with you. I just want to give you a little bit of the Yukon story. And it worked out very well. I'll share with you, it worked out well for us to be able to share some of our thoughts from the Yukon this week. What we were here doing as a government is that, and I think it's an important story for the country, is that 50 years ago, a number of Indigenous leaders went out to their communities in the Yukon, and they spoke to the citizens that they represent. And what they came up with a sort of a manifesto, a plan, and it was called Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And it laid out their vision for how they wanted to see their interaction with Canada as a federal government. And they traveled to Ottawa, and they began negotiations, which then led to 11 modern treaties in our country, really the start of modern treaty in Canada. And so we were here yesterday because it was the 50th anniversary this year. And so we brought those children of tomorrow. A number of youth came with us, and we had a trilateral meeting with Canada, and the territorial government was there. And really it was a chance to reflect on the success of that. These nations have grown immensely when it comes to their corporations, and their governance is very sophisticated, and they've drawn down a tremendous amount of of jurisdiction, both at the provincial and federal level. So it worked out great. We were here to be able to tell this story as well. So with that, again, good day to everybody. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to come and speak with you today about this evolving connection between the Indo-Pacific region and the Yukon. As Canada's westernmost northern territory, the Yukon occupies a special place in the Indo-Pacific region as the gateway to Canada's north. In the Yukon, we're working hard to foster our relationships in the circumpolar world and across the Pacific. Our unique geography, our abundance of resources, and our diverse population means we have a unique opportunity to play an important role on the world stage. And it's time we seized that opportunity. This year, I was honored to lead a Yukon business and government mission to Asia, visiting Japan and India. This mission built valuable relationships and promoted our territory as a place to live, work, and invest. I also recently returned this past week from speaking to a series of mining companies gathered at conferences in both Germany and in London. And we'll meet with EU ambassadors later this afternoon. In 2022 as well, the Whitehorse Yukon hosted an event called the Arctic Arts Summit, which was the first time Canada ever hosted that event, which had leaders from across Nordic countries, and it was a real focus on cultural diplomacy and what is happening in Canada's Arctic. So I'd like to share the opportunities that we see in these global relationships, and specifically those in the Asia-Pacific region, and then briefly touch on how we are seizing them as a territory. When people think of the Yukon's economy, they usually go straight to mining, so I'm going to start there. Our history within the Confederation is tied to the Klondike Gold Rush, and its legacy continues today. It's our 125th anniversary this year as a territory. And as Canada stands to be a key partner in the global value chain for critical minerals, it's partly thanks to Yukon's rich mineral endowment and collaborative approach to resource development with Yukon First Nations. For these reasons, our territory will play an important part in the global transition to a cleaner, greener future. The Yukon is home to multiple occurrences, about 25 of 31 critical minerals defined by the Government of Canada. Some of these commodities include copper, cobalt, tungsten, platinum, palladium, zinc, nickel, all of which Yukon hosts significant deposits. So I'll give you a sense of what that quantum looks like. There's 19 deposits defined when it comes to copper. There's about 15.3 billion pounds of copper that we have defined. When it comes to zinc, there's 25 deposits. There's about 60 billion pounds of zinc. And when it comes to tungsten, we have 2 of the top 10 deposits, largest deposits in the world. So our companies right now are in conversation with the Department of Defense in the US, and this is very key when you think about global tungsten supply. But beyond our showcasing the extensive mineral potential of the Yukon, part of our emphasis during our mission to Asia was also our commitment to reducing the environmental impact of mining activities. Embracing the urgency of addressing climate change, we've developed our own Clean Future, our 10-year strategy for a green economy and renewable energy production. When you come to the Yukon, we've worked very closely with the federal government over the last half a decade. Almost every one of our First Nation governments have their own renewable energy projects and are selling back into our energy grid. On our Asia mission, we highlighted our transition to a green economy, showcasing our modern regulatory regime and how critical minerals found in the Yukon are vital to low carbon technologies like batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicles. Our significant deposits make us well positioned to support the implementation of the Government of Canada's critical mineral strategies and contribute to the world's transition towards a cleaner future. In Japan, we heard an echo of what we hear from major players in the mining industry around the world. There is strong interest in working with stable, secure jurisdictions that can supply these critical minerals the world needs to support clean technology. I had the pleasure of meeting with players in that sphere such as Mitsubishi Materials, Dow Metals, Japan Organization of Metals and Energy Security, Japan Overseas Infrastructure Investment Corporation. So near Whitehorse, there's a community called Skagway, which is in Alaska. So through the port of Skagway, which is about an hour and a half south of Whitehorse, we have a work that's underway right now on a port. So that port is 1,000 kilometers closer to Japan than Vancouver and to the markets that you would see from Metro Vancouver. So our government is making a major and unconventional investment in the port of Skagway. Unconventional because this infrastructure is in a different country. because we appreciate and understand what access to tidewater means to potential investors. So this demonstrates our flexibility and willingness to work with partners and give our territory another key piece of infrastructure, alongside the most extensive road and fiber optic networks in Canada's north. As the Yukon works to develop critical minerals potential, this access to the Pacific will help to bring our resources to Japanese smelters and to the world. So there's already significant investment right now and interest from Japanese companies, and I would say probably the first would be Mitsubishi, who's working with Rio Tinto right now on a project just north of Whitehorse. So the magic and the mystery of the Yukon has long attracted tourists from Japan as well. And Japan continues to be an important source of visitors to the Yukon. So cultivating tourism and cultural exchange remains a great importance to our economy. Despite our northern location, the Yukon is well connected with daily jet service to multiple Canadian cities, an international airport in the capital city of Whitehorse, and seamless interline connections to major international markets. So while in Tokyo, we signed an aurora viewing, which is always a exciting opportunity for our visitors from Japan, an aurora viewing flight agreement between the government of Yukon and Japanese-based tour companies, further strengthening these ties. And what we did here on the tourism side was that the Yukon has bounced back quicker than any other province or territory in Canada when it comes to that a particular segment of our economy. From Japan, we went on to India, where we emphasized opportunities for trade and turned our focus to the recruitment of skilled labor. In the Yukon, like many other parts, we're facing labor shortages across a number of sectors, most critically in our healthcare system. So I think just before I came over, I clicked on the news, and there seems to be lots of conversation in Ontario today, and I can say the Yukon's going through those same challenges and struggles when it comes to healthcare. So we are very focused on the opportunity to work in India and to recruit. So while we're working to promote our own workforce development, we know that international recruitment needs to be part of the solution. To this end, we signed a letter of intent laying the groundwork for collaboration with the Kerala State Government agency that supports the recruitment of skilled workers by international governments, including healthcare professionals. I think it's also important to note, sitting at the Premier's table in Halifax a couple of weeks ago, we made a commitment, all premiers at the table, that we would not be trying to recruit talent from each other's province or territory. So it's really important. We're either going to have to grow it in our own province or territory, or we're going to have to go and recruit. And there's places like the Philippines that we focused on, because we have a really significant population from the Philippines in the Yukon, over 10% of the population. And yes, we have a small population, but really significant. But what we're hearing is that from leaders across the Philippines is they have their own challenges with healthcare. So we want to be very respectful in where we go and try to recruit. But interestingly enough, while I was on my trip to Delhi, along with the world, heard of Canada government's allegations surrounding the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. So I had the lucky thing of being, you might saw in the news, I was in Delhi when it happened. So that's always interesting for a Canadian Premier to be navigating that while you're sitting in India. And last week we heard, we were shocked again to learn of the new similar allegations in the United States. So, of course, these are deeply serious incidents, and we must acknowledge the extremely challenging period that Canada is now facing in our relationship with India. After I returned from India, I was fortunate enough to speak, and this was just 2 days later after what had happened, to speak to a group of Indo-Canadians gathered on Parliament Hill to celebrate Onam, a Malayali holiday. And while we were all gathered to celebrate this happy festival, there was a dark cloud over the gathering as people wrestled with the recent news and what that meant for their own personal and communal safety in Canada. But it was important for all of us to remember that we are here in Canada, gathered that night just across the street from Parliament Hill, celebrating our Indian culture and Indian history. And in doing so, we are living the dreams of our parents and grandparents each and every day. And this is why, in so many other ways, the relationship between India and Canada will remain vital to us, to our own country, and to so many Canadians. And we must keep that in mind as we move forward. Shifting, so while the Yukon, again, is rich in minerals, our most valuable resource is our people. From Yukon First Nations, we have inhabited the land since time immemorial. To descendants of the Klondike Gold Rush, whose ancestors forged the way right across the rugged north, to the newest immigrants from Ukraine, India, Philippines. Our territory is rich with diversity that many would not expect in such a far-flung corner of Canada's north. A robust local economy and a growing mining sector have been key contributors to the recent population gains, along with opportunities for an exceptional lifestyle and a beautiful natural landscape. So as a result, our population has grown 23% since 2013. This has enabled us to focus on sustainable job creation, innovation, and increased investment opportunities, while also creating the need to invest significantly in healthcare, infrastructure, recruiting skilled professionals, making housing available, and collaborating internationally to address workforce gaps. In addition, our economic mainstays of mining and tourism, we have an investment ecosystem that supports economic growth and diversification in our entrepreneurial tech sector and flourishing media and creative industries. So we just recently launched our new innovation strategy, which is designed to lay the groundwork for the next 5 years of making crucial connections such as those we're developing in the Indo-Pacific region. And the strategy prioritizes developing infrastructure and to facilitate global connections, and ensures that the Yukon is well prepared for rapid advancements in technology, energy, education, healthcare, and aligning with global trends. As I've spoken about, the Yukon is rich in minerals, including critical minerals and for clean technologies. Unlocking these resources and bringing them to market requires investment in strategic infrastructure. So when compared to other northern jurisdictions, our infrastructure is extensive and well-developed, mitigating what's recognized as a challenge for projects in the north. And safeguarding and improving infrastructure is intrinsically tied to both our economic well-being and the security of Canada's Arctic. In the Yukon, we're evaluating our strategic geographical advantage and exploring ways to capitalize on our position in the Western Arctic as the sea ice diminishes and shipping possibilities rise. Our efforts including enhancing the territory's road network, emphasizing the need for dual-use infrastructure. And that's really what we keep talking about, dual use. It's not just about the economic opportunity, but it's really about making sure that we have the right infrastructure in place as we think about Canada's Arctic. So again, as I touched on, the Port of Skagway is 1,000 kilometers closer to Tokyo or Seoul than Vancouver, and only about 180 kilometers from our capital city of Whitehorse. So this port has been a point of export for mineral concentrate and other goods for nearly a century. And the Port of Skagway offers year-round, ice-free, deep-water capability for handling large vessel traffic, providing direct access to international markets. So I would, just to give you a sense of infrastructure investment before I close out, which will give you a sense. So we have this small population. So we're about the size of Germany and Austria combined, 480,000 square kilometers. So right now, we're in the midst where we have a spend, and this is really about, I have to give compliments to Canada, because we've worked very closely with the federal government and using the funding that's been rolled out over the last half a decade. So right now, we're closing out building a 777-kilometer fiber line, which will connect all of Canada's north with redundancy when it comes to fiber. So it's about a $100 million investment, very significant. It's very technical. It was 1,100 water crossings. We had a directional drill under the Mackenzie Delta, and that project will go live next year. We have $250 million going into our international airport. We're about 1/3 of the way into that particular project. We have 5,000 kilometers of all-weather roads, but we've got a package of about $500 million of public-private partnership dollars, which we're now deploying into that particular area. And we have other strategic pieces of infrastructure that really connect us to Alaska. One particular bridge that we have to rebuild, and the cost is about $165 million. So all of that is underway right now. So it gives you a sense of how, as a territory, we're really investing to make sure that the right the right pieces of infrastructure in play for the dynamics we're seeing when it comes to the economy. Just to give you a sense too, when it comes to the mineral sector and what we're seeing from companies around the world, Newmont, the world's largest gold miner, is in the midst of just going permitting to build a new project. I was meeting with Rio Tinto this week in London. Again, they're looking in partnership with Mitsubishi at about a $3 billion project. B2 Gold, a large gold mining company, has now just made significant investment. Hecla, which is North America's largest silver producer, has just done an acquisition and is again looking to expand. Tech Resources, many others. So a lot of activity happening. So really today, I just wanted to share a perspective on this evolving relationship between the Indo-Pacific region. So a lot of that work and opportunities are being driven specifically right out of Japan and the interest that there's there, but also understanding the significance of these relationships are really crucial to our growth. So with a commitment to environmental stewardship, ongoing sustainable mining practice, successful partnerships with First Nation governments, the Yukon remains a leader in the global transition to a more responsible future of mining, clean energy, and innovation. And the Yukon goes beyond untapped potential. It embodies a community characterized by a resilient spirit, a trait shared with the Indo-Pacific region. So in closing, let's reflect on the many dimensions of this growing relationship and underscore its crucial relevance to both Indo-Pacific region and the Yukon. So my hope is that we can continue to build our relationships, embrace fresh ideas, attract new investors, and welcome residents to strengthen and enhance our ecosystem. So again, thank you today for having the opportunity to share some words, and look forward to answering some questions with Ken. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Premier. I believe you had a meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday. And of the many things that you discussed, I was very much interested in the Arctic. So we'll get right to the Arctic. One of the things that the both of you agreed is that prosperity of the Arctic while defending Canadian sovereignty and upholding regional security. There's two parts to that. The prosperity of the Arctic, with the Yukon being like at the gateway of the Northeast-West Passage. So I'd like to hear about the potentials of that passage and how Yukon can play a role in this changing logistical landscape. And also the second part is about the sovereignty and upholding regional security, and perhaps what China and Russia may be doing in the Arctic. So, but the security we'll talk later. Let's first talk about the prosperity of the Arctic. Could you talk about that?
Okay, I think we're there. Yeah, of course this has been on our minds as a government. We're watching the changing focus on the Arctic. I mean, I think many countries in the circumpolar world have advanced projects quicker than we have in Canada. Look, we have, as a country, we have to really focus on the infrastructure build out, and we have to have a true Arctic and Northern policy that is being embraced by the Arctic, not just by the federal government and Southern Canadians, but it also has to have a strategic plan that's going to be able to deploy the resources that we need. We use the word, and you'll hear it a lot, it's dual purpose infrastructure. So, I mean, one of the things we talked to the Prime Minister about, and we've been quite vocal, is ensuring that we have a grid connection, because we have an orphan grid when it comes to our electrical grid. We produce our own power. It's about 90% clean energy from hydro. But inevitably, we're going to have to, when we look at the growth, we're going to have to see a connection to the North American grid. And we've been in discussions with the government of British Columbia about connecting to their grid, and then inevitably to the North American grid. Why is that important? Well, it's important because it's going to help us fuel the prosperity of the Yukon. We know that major mining companies that are looking for these critical minerals, they're not looking to use diesel. They're not using, they would rather not be using LNG. They'd rather be using a clean energy source, and that's what we hear at the table. And they will make decisions globally about where their capital goes based on, what the right set of circumstances is. So we have to take that into consideration, at least for many of our projects. That's what we're hearing from the major mining companies that we're talking to. With that being said, it's all about making sure that companies that come to the north are sitting down with First Nation governments first and foremost. There is a focus in from our government on economic reconciliation. We believe that those partnerships will be key to building a foundation for the stability that is required and the social license to build out the projects that we need across the north. I would also say that I think within the dual purpose, we're looking at what's happening in Canada's Arctic. So we have a tiny coastline in the Yukon. For many Canadians in the room, you might, you think about Northwest Territories and Nunavut, but there is a small, and it's on the Beaufort Sea. And we have what is potentially the only area for a deep water port in the western part of Canada's coastline. in the north. It's something that's been pondered for decades and decades. So we have done some early work. We have worked with First Nations governments in that particular area to make sure that we have what we would call an easement into what's called King Point, the area that has been defined as a potential. And we're just closely watching what's happening across the country when it comes to major projects. And I think, look, I think when we talk about Canada and major projects, it takes a long time to get something built in Canada. It does. And we have to figure this out. So when I, as a policymaker and as a former minister of energy, mines and resources, and I had a chance to chair that table a number of years ago with the federal minister and have been on the economic development table for almost a decade, I would say when we think about that area as a shipping route, and we take into consideration if we're projecting that in 25 years, this could be a major shipping route, let's say top 5 shipping routes in the world, top 10, we're already behind. We're talking about multiple stages of environmental assessment. Once we define what the project looks like, multiple partnerships with very sophisticated First Nations governments in that particular area. And in Beaufort, it's the Inuvialuit who do amazing work. But we're going to have to all come together and figure out what the model is to fund it and to have a presence. And so, yes, on the eastern side of Canada, there is conversations and there's early work and they're trying to sort of de-risk these concepts. But as a country, we're already behind. And I would say, Ken, every time I sit down with, it's incredible, whether it's India or Japan, somebody's coming in saying, look, we have an Arctic strategy. We have an Arctic strategy, so should we tell you what our Arctic strategy is for Northern Canada? And, I think we as a country have to make sure that we understand the importance of getting it right now. So lots of prosperity available for the North, but we have to figure out our long-term plans.
But is it 25 years later, though? How many months of the year is it possible to go through the Northwest Passage?
Well, look, I think that's changing all the time, and and I would leave it. There's a tremendous amount of folks in here, and probably academics that know much more than I do when it comes to this. But I can say it's dramatically changing, and we're probably going to see, when do we get to ice-free, or when is it going to be attainable to go through there 12 months of the year? I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of factors. Fueling stations. There's a lot of risk. But what I do know is people are very focused on it, and our neighbors, at least to the west of Alaska and to the west of Canada, seem to be doing major investments in infrastructure. I have a budding relationship with the governor of Alaska, which is kind of a neat thing you get to do when you're in the Yukon. We're in the midst of putting together a bilateral agreement. There's a tremendous amount of course, defense infrastructure in Alaska, which is good for us and good for all Canadians to keep us safe. But at the same time, they're also grappling with this, and they look to see activity off their coast, and they're trying to ensure that the federal government in the U.S. understands the importance, and they've just put a new center in Anchorage, Alaska, to really think through these things and to work with Washington. So it's a focus for us, but it has to be a focus. Like, we're a small subnational government. We're in the midst of building a port that's $40 to $50 million in Skagway, Alaska, and we're doing that because Canada doesn't build infrastructure of that type in the U.S. So we have to go and partner with a municipal government in the U.S. It's really quite interesting to build this out. But we have to do it because Canadian companies and Canadian commodities need to get to Tidewater. So that's some of our challenges.
Before we go to Skagway, just one more on the Arctic. And in your discussions with the Alaskan governor, do you talk about China and Russia activity in the new melted waters?
We do. Yeah, we do. There was a situation not too long ago, and we look, I'll be very open with the room, where the ability for us to communicate as a country to subnational governments, we have to continue to look at improving that. So, I've get something from another premier, and we see that there's activity off the coast of Alaska, and Alaska's in the same boat. Excuse the pun there, see these boats there, and they're going, listen, nobody from Washington called us, but who's watching this? So it's a conversation, and we really, the national governments have a focus, but we have to be able to let, because the people that I represent have an expectation that I have a sense of what's going on as well, even if it's just off the coast of the Yukon. So we've pulled together, we'll make some announceables, which I think people in the room will find fun very soon, but we have been gathering a group of academics and defense experts, because we need to be able to have the proper expertise and advisement, even at a subnational level. So it is something that continues to be focused on. I will say, look, we're looking for even some minor defense investment. So I'm meeting with a Minister of Defense tomorrow and Minister Jolie, and part of what I'm looking for is even to see, I want to see an investment in a reserve unit. I mean, we see the Canadian, which is interesting, 1 in 10 jobs in Canadians military need to be filled. And we have this disproportionate interest in the Yukon where people want to serve and they want to do community service and they want to serve their country. So with that being said, we think there's no reserve unit, and we want to have that in place, and we have some Department of Defense infrastructure, and we think that's a smart place for Canada to go. There is something called the Canadian Rangers, which is sort of like a militia and really grassroots-based expertise when it comes to field craft and the North. But we also think we'd like to be able to contribute greater to the Canadian Department of Defense cause.
All right. Let's talk about Skagway, very interesting port, which is actually, as you said, not in Yukon, but in Alaska, and you're going to invest in that foreign port. How does that investment work?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, look, for anybody from the U.S. that's in the room, it's really intriguing because, of course, there's a real respect for levels of government. I think in Canada, the federal government will mix things up with the provinces or territories, and we'll mix things up with municipalities. And what's been interesting, starting with meeting with the ambassador of the U.S. to Canada, is, we were trying to craft a partnership with the municipality in Skagway, and it was a hands-off approach. Because it was a municipal government, you're going to have to go and do the work with them. And what we tried to share in those conversations is we have a bilateral agreement on critical minerals between Canada and the U.S. Well, if there's no port, how do you get the critical minerals from Canada to the U.S.? So please help us. But it was a hands-off approach. So we have to navigate all of these relationships very closely ourselves. Secondly, with the state, same thing. So we've been actually negotiating directly with the Mayor of Skagway. That's what we have to do. So we are trying to unlock the critical minerals of Canada's northwest, and it's a sub-regional government meeting with a municipal government. So we're working with them right now, and we've just gone out to a tender process. So we're looking at a marine services platform. It's about 270 feet long. We can put different types of infrastructure on top of that to make sure that we can tie into our supply chains. But that would be used to ship copper, that would be used to ship silver, that would be used to ship a number of commodities. So we have a copper a play that's been using that area. It goes back to mining 50 years ago in the Yukon. It's been used for almost a century, but it was really been built over the last 50 years. So we're investing, but the community will own the infrastructure, and then we'll have preferred access for Canadian companies to be able to use that. And the other challenge, Ken, we have is Skagway, Alaska, for anybody who's gone on a cruise ship, it's a mecca of cruise ship travel. So it's a town of like 1,000 people, and last summer they had 1.19 million visitors. It's like 5 streets wide. It's incredible. And so so they'll do as much cruise ship traffic as Seattle or Vancouver next summer. So we have to figure out how to work with them. So believe it or not, there's there's a rail line. It's a narrow gauge rail line that's there that's used for tourist traffic. Mm-hmm. But Blackstone has bought the company that owns that. So we were in New York last year sitting with Blackstone saying, please, how can we use this as a dual purpose? Because we're inevitably going to have to modernize what goes on that narrow gauge line, or it's going to have to shift over. And we need to use it to run commodities because we can't have that truck traffic. It's like you come into Skagway, Alaska. It's a beautiful place, but it's a very significant drop over a mountain range. And trucking that much commodities at a consistent effort is a real challenge.
Right, let's talk a little bit about your trip to India.
Sure.
You said it was for recruitment for the medical industry.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about what's happening on the ground, the shortage of people, and what's really happening?
Sure. Yeah, like everywhere. I mean, it was pretty surprising to see the closures, like the list of things in Ontario. And I'm like, it's not picking on Ontario. I have good relationship with Ontario provincial leaders and with all leaders. We're all dealing with this. But I think every province and territory is trying their very best to deal. First, we're grappling with cost because we see this aging population, and the patients that we're dealing with the situation is more complex. So that's a challenge. I think we're coming out of COVID and we have, an underlying mental health crisis across the country, and that's exacerbating our healthcare challenges. So all of these things are happening at once. We've got, whether we want to embrace it or not, you look at what fentanyl's done, it's really hurting the Yukon. We have one of the highest rates of death from fentanyl, but it's a North American problem. It's just in a smaller community, you see it closer. You know the folks that it's happened to, but it's something that, we heard the president of the US speak about it in Parliament when he was here. So all of those things are happening, and we're trying to find people to do the work. And we need to move.
And why India?
Well, why India? I think India because, look, it's India because the talent is incredible. It was a comfortable thing too for me. My dad came here in 1968 and just retired at 83 years old as a doctor in Nova Scotia, spent his whole career. So, I was comfortable with that thought of understanding the talent that was there. And this has been a long relationship with this country. So what we found in our trip to India in Kerala was incredible talent, an absolutely incredible talent. Kerala is a state that has the highest literacy rate in the country of India. Very easy to sit down with their organizations and understand, identify what we need for talent, an interest to come to Canada, a huge interest to come to Canada. And as well, even in Delhi, sitting down with some of the other organizations. So we think it makes sense. Of course, there's lots of folks from India continuing to come here as students and to change their or increase their their life path. And of course, we have an incredible quality of life here. So we were happy to see things calm down when it comes to visas, because we really, this for us, it's going to be key in order to recruit in India, and we're very focused on it. So going into 2024, 2 tracks. One, serious challenges that has happened between our relationship. The other one, we need to make sure that we focus on building the positive parts of the relationship.
Right. So I want to ask about the relationship. But
Sure.
while you think of your answer, let me tell you the Japanese perspective, right? So we were very surprised by the recent spat between Canada and India, and also India and the US, because I think from the Japan's perspective, right now the world is a G1 status, so there's only one superpower, which is the US. But in 2030, we're moving not to a G2 world, but a G3 world, which would be US, China, and India. And in 2040, we're going to move to a G4 status, with Indonesia becoming the number 4. And if you look at the G7 of 2040, what are the 7 members that would make the G7? It's the G3, which is US, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, and then EU as a bloc, and Russia as the number 7. That's probably the G7. And then if something like Ukraine happens, it's going to be US, Japan, and EU on one side, and China and Russia on the other side. And then there'll be 2 casting votes, India and Indonesia. And India and Indonesia don't have to fully embrace Russia or fully embrace the US. Just by tilting towards one side, the geopolitical landscape is decided. So India, from Japan's perspective, is important in that sense. From that standpoint, do you have any thoughts on the Canadian government's response to the recent incident in India, regarding India?
I guess when you join or you get into a political role, you quickly find out that things aren't black and white. And so you understand that things are complex and relationships are complex. And so I think everybody in this room knows that, because that's the work most people do. But it's something, I got to learn as I went through it. So I would say that we are going to have to be very staunch on our perspective of somebody coming into our country, and the U.S. will do the same thing. But at the same time, we have to make sure when it comes to B2B, like the interconnectivity between Canadian investment into India is incredible. Plus the diaspora from India that exists in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal, Halifax, and those things and those relationships are so critical that we're going to continue to have that 2-tier relationship. The other thing is, I would say, look, I talked to an old friend last week who, without saying, I'll say, was a very well-known ambassador in the context of the conversation you're having this week, maybe had one of the most important roles in the last decade for this country. And what he said to me was, can we be at odds with that many people as a country? That's a lot of people that we're not partnering with if it's going to be China and India over the whole on the globe. So I think we have to figure out who we are partnering with, how we're going to partner, and yes, relationships are complex, and it's very difficult to sell that work to the Canadian, to anybody in Canada. The average person who's sitting down and living their life and working are like, why are you? Somebody did something wrong, and why are you doing this? That you shouldn't be making, why are you making friends with this person? But I think we all understand, like this is and it's incredibly important that we figure out ways to build the relationships. And I think that sub-national governments is the key. So the federal government can have the posture that they have, but you're right, Saskatchewan, so tied, their economy, and the focus of Premier Moe on the relationship. British Columbia, amazing population diaspora. So, investment from Ontario. So I think the job now is for the sub-regional governments, the sub-national governments, to go and build those relationships. That's the offer I've made yesterday to the Prime Minister, and I will continue to make it to my colleagues, because I think we can navigate some of those more choppy waters in a way that's not going to bring the same level of pressure and attention, but it's going to be good, positive things that we can do.
That's very interesting. So we are standing between everyone's lunch. Anybody have any questions? Oh, we are almost out of time, but yes, please feel free.
I was just curious to ask you, Pranay, what was your day like the day the Chinese balloon showed up over Yukon?
Yeah, I had a chat with David Commons in CBC, and he's laughed at me. He's like, you've had this job for a year. You've had the Chinese balloon in your first week on the job. You were in India the day that the information, so I don't know, it's a test. What was interesting? I sat with Ian Bailey on Thursday from the Globe here, and we had just signed the healthcare transfer agreement. And he said, what are your thoughts about the future of the North and the Arctic, and are you concerned? And I said, absolutely, I'm concerned. And we were working on an agreement on the Beaufort Sea, the governance of that area, which we signed this summer. And I just said, I think we really need to focus on the Arctic. It's just a matter of time before something happens. And to be open to the table, I walked away from the interview. It was just across the street from here. We did it in the art gallery. And I walked away, and I'm like, God, it's like a week on this job, and he is going to think that I am out to lunch, because he's like, do you really think something like this is going to happen? And I doubled down. I said, yeah, I think something's going to happen. So then I went and packed, and I flew to Vancouver the next day. And by the time I got to Vancouver, the balloon had been shot down over the Beaufort. And then the next day, and then we started the conversation with Canada. And then the next day, the second balloon was shot down. And then Canada was deploying resources. So it was wild. I mean, we were trying to make sure that there was a proper communication protocol. I think that's my takeaway, again, with Canada. The federal government works in a particular way, and there's folks here from the federal government that I tend to have great relationships with. And we were in a position saying, look, there's two things you have to do. You have to be able to speak with the provincial territorial governments when something like this happens. We hadn't had something like that happen, of course, on domestic soil, anything like that. And the second piece is, if we're talking about reconciliation, you need to ensure that you're speaking with Indigenous leaders, because you're about to go into their backyard, into their home with really significant resources. And they can be very supportive and helpful in those endeavors, because nobody knows those areas better. So it was an intense day, I think. But the folks that were deployed by the Canadian government over that week were absolutely incredible. And I mean, Canada just has so much expertise and talent that folks that do quiet work that none of us know about, that keep us safe. So it was a definite interesting week 2 on the job. Yeah.
Anybody else? Good. Oh, all right.
Hello, Premier. I just want to thank you very much for coming to this group to speak as well. Roberto Bagnato from Export Development Canada, Canada's export credit agency. One of the privileges that we have at Export Development Canada is being able to tell the story of Canadian businesses who have taken their business and gone global across the world, obviously now with a focus on the Indo-Pacific as well. One of the stories we've told in the last year is of Joella Hogan, owner of Yukon Soaps, based in Mayo, Yukon. And her story was around taking, what started off as a small business and growing that into a business that we've identified in the mid-segment, over 10 million in revenue, and gone global with the support of federal and provincial partners like EDC in the province of Yukon. My question to you is, how can we better, as a collective group here, with the federal partners and our provincial partners, better support stories like Joella's and getting those companies out to the Indo-Pacific region, where it's clear that there's challenges, especially those in the Yukon, which are very unique geographically as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I think you've done phenomenal work. I mean, in the sense that the opportunities that through economic development that I've seen where you have a presence on the ground and our entrepreneurs can come and meet and understand the programs that are available. Look, I think when it comes to the federal government, whatever Crown Corporation or department, it's coming and spending time with us. And I think you have to plug into the government departments that exist, like economic development. We have a great, phenomenal group of folks that are there that do great work. And I think it's about, for anybody else, if it's on the investment side, it's, again, reaching out to economic development to us. And I think we can plug in well, because we're really, it's a small department, but it's nimble. So if I can, Ken, I'm going to a couple stats for you. So we've had the lowest unemployment rate, and this is, it's a props to our economic development department. We have the lowest unemployment rate, again, this last month, 3.6%. We've had a pretty much lowest unemployment rate for the last half a decade, pretty much month to month. Our GDP growth by percentage was 10% in 2020 and 8.5% in 2021. You remember what was happening at that point. So we mine gold, and I support gold, and I'm happy to see $2,100 gold, and many in the room may not, but gold's good when you're in the Yukon, and so it keeps things moving. And I think from a standpoint of growth, I touched on that from population growth. But the other thing, what's really neat about the government is it's nimble. So about, I remember March 5th or March 6th, 2020, I was in Toronto. Everything kind of, the world got shaken up. But our public servants, the reason why they're great to plug into, and they know who's on the ground, they know all the entrepreneurs, is they're so talented and nimble. So we struck the first of its kind program in Canada, which was our business relief program. So we brought business leaders together within the first 4 days, and then public servants worked and ungodly hours. There's a crazy amount of work. And we just, did it differently. And within 9 days, we had capitalized the program and started to deploy funds. And we paid the fixed costs. Yes, we can do that in a small region. We paid the fixed costs of our small and medium businesses across the board. There was an application process, and we just funded it. We said, whatever it's going to need, we need to do that. We rolled out the first sick leave program in the country, and then 9 other programs. So we had Ontario government, Manitoba, and others reaching out to us at the provincial level saying, like, well, can we have your program framework? So we shared our policy framework to other jurisdictions across the country, months later. And so we were quick out of the gates, and that helped us. The same group too, just as interest for the business folks in the room, we've just put together the first government-funded sick leave for the private sector. So it started with a week, but we're now funding that for the private sector because we want to make sure in our jurisdiction, where there's lots of government employee, that we are having a level playing field as well for the private sector. So anyway, the reason I say is plug in to those folks because we are constantly working hand in hand with entrepreneurs, especially many of our Indigenous entrepreneurs that are in fashion and different things throughout rural Yukon that will have a lot of uptake in the Indo-Pacific. There'll be lots of interest. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Everyone, it's lunchtime.
Yeah. Thanks.